Wouldn't it be nice to have several thought leaders in your industry know and love your brand? Start a podcast. Invite your industry's thought leaders to be guests on your show, and start reaping the benefits of having a network full of industry influencers. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Hi there, and welcome to the B2B Growth Show. I'm John Ruggi, and I'm the founder of a marketing consultancy called Flag and Frontier that helps B2B tech companies with messaging and positioning. I host our category creation series here, where we explore how and why companies design and dominate new market categories. Now, in today's episode, I'm going to talk with Ryan Bonnici, who's the CMO of G2. It's a community that millions of people participate in every month to make better decisions about buying software. Not only has Ryan spent time in his career at Microsoft, ExactTarget, Salesforce, and HubSpot, he was also selected as one of the world's most influential CMOs by Forbes. Now, we titled this episode, Why the Category Name Matters Less Than You Think, because in this conversation, Ryan and I break down the misperception that designing a category means that you have to have an official category name on a site like G2. Ryan's a super sharp guy, and he's got some unique perspectives to share on marketing. So without further ado, let's hear from Ryan Bonnici at G2. So welcome to the Category Creation Series on the B2B Growth Show. I'm John Ruggi, and with me today is Ryan Bonnici, who is CMO at G2. Ryan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, thanks, John. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. It's getting cold outside, which I like. And, I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. I think a lot of people know of you if they don't know you personally, but what can you tell us, or what should our listeners know about you beyond the fact that you're CMO at G2 today?
They can probably tell from my accent that I'm not from the US. I'm Australian. Spent most of my career living and working in Australia. Love marketing. Actually, love is like an understatement. I'm obsessed with marketing, and I'm obsessed with brands, and I'm obsessed with growth and category creation specifically. So just like I live and breathe this stuff. It's not just a job for me. Like I genuinely really love it. As is kind of clearly seen if you look through my phone image gallery, you will just see screenshots of things like ads, like social media posts. Like I'm literally constantly kind of consuming content and screenshotting it and sending it to my team, or thinking about it myself and what we can do. So yeah, that's kind of me in terms of my work context. Outside of work, I love kite surfing, love being in the outdoors, and I'm big kind of advocate for like mental health, and talking about mental health as something that's no different to your physical health.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And you'll have to show me your phone sometime, because it sounds like it's basically just a glorified swipe file for all your marketing.
A little bit.
images.
It's annoying, actually. Like it's really hard for me to find photos that I'm looking for, because there are so many screenshots. I really need to get into a better habit of deleting them after I take screenshots. But alas, like I'm too far deep now to fix that.
Yeah, this is the life of an obsessed marketer.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, all the episodes I've done on this series so far have been with people who have either designed categories, and we're kind of talking about that success story, or they're on the front end of that process and they're just going down this path of category design. And our interview is going to be a little bit different today, because unless I'm wrong, and correct me if this is the case, I don't think G2 is going down the path of category design today. and again, tell me if I'm wrong on that, but you guys play a huge role in what people think of as categories themselves.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think most of my kind of experience in category creation was probably from my time at Exact Target in building kind of like that customer life cycle, like 360-degree view of customer kind of like category space, and then inbound marketing during my time at HubSpot. And yes, that's definitely right. Like at G2, I think like what we're creating is definitely like unique and different for sure. And I think we were definitely the first company to build this concept of B2B reviews that are like peer authenticated. But I'm not sure if that is a category in itself, because essentially what we're building is the world's largest B2B marketplace. So we're building sort of what Amazon is for consumers. We're building that for businesses. So I don't think in that sense, like, not to say that what we're doing isn't really awesome and interesting, but I don't think it's category creation.
Yeah. I know you guys have some interesting things on your roadmap that maybe you are at liberty to talk about, or maybe you're not, but it'll certainly be interesting to see what the future holds for you. But yeah, so I'll give you a little backstory. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. So when I first learned about category creation, my mind immediately went to the sites like G2 and some of your competitors, and I equated category design with like this idea of like someone's like a term that someone's using in their messaging is officially coined on G2 or by Gartner or someone like that. Now I've got an opinion on that, but before the show is really to hear your thoughts. So tell me what do you think, or how do you think categories play? What role do they play in the B2B buying process today?
That's a good question. I mean, I think they play a few different roles, and I think the way sort of the reason why categories are really important to us at G2 is, we have, millions of reviews from people around the world using different pieces of software and technology, right? Really comprehensive, in-depth, like 30-point plus like reviews. Like, they're not like thumbs up, thumbs down. They're very in-depth. And for us, right, I think like the value that we are bringing and, the value prop for G2.com is essentially that, you can come to our site and you can tell us, what software category you're looking for, or broad category or service category you're looking for. And then you can tell us, what type of company are you, B2B, B2C, how many employees do you have, what features do you want? And then we'll basically give you, a personalized recommendation for that category specifically that you were looking for. And it's not just for that category, it's then based on companies like you that have used software in that category, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where we're completely polar opposites to all of our competitors, in that, all of our recommendations and content is personalized for you, because there's no such thing as one size fits all. And so I'm quite like anti that like analyst model where there's like some person sitting at the top of an ivory tower choosing like who is the best CRM or the best marketing automation, because like no one is the best realistically. There's a couple categories though, like where there are clear leaders that can seemingly scale to most sizes of businesses very well. But that's not to say though that like they're necessarily the best for you or for everyone. And so anywho, the reason why that's really important and why I share that is that like for us, when we're giving those really personalized recommendations, you can't really compare apples to apples if you don't have like a clear cut of like who are the potential sellers, vendors, products in a certain category, right? Because like, let's use two different categories as an example, right? Like let's use like an artificial intelligence category, and then let's use an email marketing category. For an email marketing category where, it's been around for 20 plus years, it's like very firm around like, what does that category mean? People have bought those tools many times. So they may be more likely to respond with like more 5s out of 10, or sorry, more 10s out of 10, or like higher ratings, because like the products in that space have evolved and become more kind of tailored to the needs of the user and the buyer.
Sure.
For AI software, right, that's very new as an example, there might be, a few different players out there, but they may be kind of scattered, and there may not be like subsectors of that broader category just yet. And so you can't really compare, like when we're personalizing our results to give you the best, advice that you're looking for. If we were grouping sort of, products across categories in, we wouldn't really then be able to give very good recommendations. So that's really important to us to make sure that the recommendations we're giving are really fair and we're comparing them, adequately to people with similar features in the same space and category. So I think that's why it's important to us, in terms of like our data and our products. But I think it's important to buyers as well, right? Because like categories are essentially just shortcuts for them, shortcuts to try and work out like, whether we call it a category or a bucket or, like a landscape of different tools. Like it's basically, there are these different groupings and that helps them make decisions and work out, what are the things that I need for the different parts of my business and for the different functions. So
Yeah.
I think like as shortcuts, they can be very useful to buyers, especially, more beginner buyers that maybe haven't bought lots of tools before. Whereas for advanced buyers, they may not need categories to find the different products. They may already know a bunch of those products in that space.
Sure. So it sounds like for someone who's trying to really kind of find their way through different products out there and they're not really familiar with what everything does, what they should expect one thing to do and not do, the categories for them are a real, like you said, shorthand for kind of finding their way to the right product or the right solution faster.
Yeah, exactly. And I almost think of it as kind of like a bit of like a Russian doll-esque idea in the sense of like, someone might come to our site looking for sales software and then we'll ask them some questions on our site. They'll engage with our AI chatbot to like better help us understand what is it that they're trying to do. Like are they trying to increase sales rep productivity or are they trying to increase kind of like reporting on sales activities? And if it's, reporting, then we might push them down like a BI path of like BI categories and content. If they're looking for sales enablement or training, then it might be more about kind of, different enablement tools to help their sales reps become more productive.
Mm-hmm.
So I think categories are useful as a shortcut for sure, but I actually think the most useful thing really is like starting with what are the problems that you're trying to solve as a buyer. Sales rep productivity is one of those. If you're a sales manager, if you're a chief financial officer or an accountant, then maybe you're trying to like solve the problem of how do I close my books faster every month, to report my earnings back to our board. And if that's the case, then there's different software that's going to be right for you. And so I think categories are very useful, but I think actually like getting down to the heart of like what is the problem that the category and the software solves, and working from that will lead you down, the best path for you on your journey in terms of finding what's best for your company.
Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned that because one of the ideas in the book Play Bigger, which is kind of like the gospel on category design, is that if you're thinking through the category design process, you really need to think about problem first. So, problem market fit. And if you look at the narratives of companies who have really built some of these major categories, it's not so much about the category name itself. That is important to a degree, but it's really the underlying narrative, the underlying problem that they're trying to use to connect with people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like that's the most important. And I think, as B2B marketers, we oftentimes get too caught up in sort of like features and functionality.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't focus enough on, what's the problem and like what are the emotions that this thing is solving for.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you mentioned a moment ago with this idea of like Russian nesting dolls with kind of categories within categories. Because I saw this the other day, I was looking at the account-based marketing space and I expected there just to be an ABM category, and that was kind of it. But what I found was that you have multiple variations on account-based marketing software. I don't remember the exact words and phrases that are used today, but that's an example of a category that was then kind of broken up, and then there were subcategories off of that. And so, maybe with that example in mind, can you walk us through how your team approaches like naming and dubbing categories? Do you look for guidance from the software companies themselves? Do you look for guidance from buyers? I don't imagine you do this in an ivory tower, but what does that process look like?
Yeah, good question. So to your point, right? So account-based marketing or ABM is definitely like quite a large, broad term, right? Then there's account-based advertising, account-based intelligence, account-based execution, account-based analytics. There's a lot of different subsectors. And I think like what's worth noting maybe is that I think if you look at kind of our site versus a lot of our competitors, we have typically around 3x the number of categories, let alone products on our site. So
really?
we're going to
as many.
we're going to a lot more detail, not only in reviews. So we have more reviews than any one individual, competitor out there. But we're going into a lot more detail in terms of how we're categorizing those products, because the better we can categorize, the better we can give recommendations. Because, right, if we use ABM as a grouping, you could effectively call Sendoso, which is, direct mail software that connects into your CRM solution, like a Salesforce, and allows you to execute on an ABM strategy. That kind of is account-based execution software, but that's very different execution to, something like an account-based advertising platform that's running ads online, and the features and how we would compare those different things and the pricing and everything is totally different. And so we spend a lot of time and money on making sure that, we're categorizing properly. And I guess that kind of leads me into kind of what you're asking. So we basically start to look at the space, and as we start to see kind of sectors forming within it, and kind of clusters of products in a new space, that will be how we then start to indicate, okay, is there kind of a breakout subcategory within this broader category that we should be looking more into? And we have a lot of rules and details around how we do create those things. So I don't think, and we have some pretty pretty detailed guidelines that I won't remember top of mind, because this is our research team that does this. But, based on the number of providers in a space is also important, right? If there's just one product out there that's doing something new and different, I don't know if that would then warrant us breaking out a new subcategory. We might, depending on kind of the momentum around people moving to that. If they had a lot of customers and maybe then no one else had cracked the code on how to build a product similar, then we probably would, right? Because we can see the momentum. But if you look at our sort of the way we visualize data in terms of, how satisfied are your customers, and then what is your market share, market presence. So we're factoring in both of those things to start to work out, okay, are there enough customers in a new space, and are there enough of those different competitors as well as different, users of them to then give kind of size to that new subcategory.
Sure.
And so we don't really then, I guess you kind of asked as a sub question, how much input do we get from sellers or vendors? We're always open for them to give us their thoughts, but that doesn't mean that we will create a category for them. And we we'll often get them asking because they want to, they're trying to coin a term and they want to create a category around that term. And we definitely won't do that unless we can see momentum around that as a true category. And so again, part of what that means is we would look into kind of search volume and trends, and are people actually searching for this as a category, or is it just one seller or vendor that's talking about it? Are people talking about it on social media, on Quora and Reddit and these different forums? So our research team, are incredibly thorough in terms of how we go about this. And again, they have kind of internal processes they use, which we don't completely share all of that externally, just so that we don't want folks to try and game our algorithm. But we share quite a lot about it at the high level, but we don't share some of the weightings around how our categories work. And we build in pretty detailed things like time decay into reviews, for example. So a review from 5 years ago is worth less in terms of your weighting than a review from 3 days ago. And there's so many different sort of levels that we've built into our algorithm over time to avoid folks gaming it. Even to the point where if a review came in organically from someone through Google that was just searching, as opposed to if it was a customer of the seller and they promoted that person to leave a review, we would weight that review less than someone that came organically. Again, this is just scratching the surface really of how deep we go on this, but this is literally kind of the meat and veg of our business. So we take it very seriously.
Sure. So if I'm a vendor and I'm looking at the way my business is placed within G2, and I'm thinking, yeah, it's kind of close, but there's not really a better place for me. They feel like they don't have a good home. There's kind of two scenarios they have to weigh. One would be maybe the category that they're in now, maybe it's not perfect, but they're getting some attention because there's search traffic and interest. It's a known category. But then
Mm.
there's also the risk that if it's not quite a good fit, then they have the wrong expectations of what they're supposed to do. And then when they look closer at the product, they shake their heads no, because it's not quite what they were looking for, not quite what they had in mind. So maybe there's a case for then creating a new message to kind of break out from that. So what's your advice to a vendor if they find themselves in that spot?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is like thinking about a category is still a pretty superficial way to think about products in comparisons ultimately. And we do that just because to what I was saying earlier is like if you are a beginner to a certain category and you're searching a parent category like sales software, and then we help you kind of like get more granular. At the end of the day, that is still just meant to be a shortcut. Really, I think where the meat of like what we provide is in like the live comparisons. So where you can actually compare, like we were talking about, account-based marketing earlier, right? Like if we're talking about account-based advertising, then you're like where you can truly compare Engagio to Terminus, right? Or if it's CRM software, you can truly compare Infusionsoft to HubSpot. And then when you're comparing it, now you're like getting into like the actual features that make up the category itself. And so now you're looking at like of all of the hundreds of or thousands of people that have reviewed these two software or 5 pieces of software, right? Mm-hmm. You can compare more than as many as you want. Then you can start to see like, okay, like where do these folks like rank and stack on those certain features? And now, based on what you know about like what you need from the tool, you can then make a decision. So the categories, like I don't want to call them vanity because they're not. They're definitely more important than that. But again, they're just like an important earlier step in that process. But a lot of buyers don't need categories, right? Like they'll already have heard about a few different vendors and they'll come in already with intent around company X versus company Y. And then from there, they may learn about company Z, where they can then like add that into their comparison because we'll then show them alternatives based on what they've then said to us. So I think like kind of like to round out your question, like if you are, building a software company or building a category, I mean, it would be educational for sure for you to look at the current categories that exist, but I don't think that necessarily means you need to kind of design your product or service for those categories because, again, like I said, no category is perfect for anyone realistically, and there will always be some features that like you are or are not optimized for, or there might be crossover into other categories, and that's why we have pretty clear and public rules around like what is it that, like what features do you need to have if you want to be able to like show your product in a certain category. So like if we use the account-based sort of like umbrella again, right? Like, a platform like Terminus would be in account-based execution software because of their advertising components, but they'd also be an account-based reporting software because of their reporting features. Yeah. And, one of their competitors may not have any reporting yet. And so if they weren't and they didn't have, the more robust reporting features that we require to be in the reporting subcategory, then they wouldn't make it there until they did have that. So, they could work with our research team to better understand what those things are. But again, and our research team is also kind of like learning as well and evolving these categories over time. So if we start to see shifts, then we will, the categories and the products are all very much like living.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like what you're saying is companies shouldn't get overly hung up on the categories that are present in your platform today. It's really more important to understand the problem they're trying to solve, and the features that are important to those.
Absolutely.
Those buyers,
absolutely.
Right?
And I think that's where like, it can be quite like informative coming to G2 and reading literally the reviews about your competitors, right? Everything's available. So if you're a really smart CEO or product leader, like let's go out there and look at the existing categories and see, okay, like what are they all saying? Is there general sentiment in a certain category that like one part of a product isn't working, and like, okay, do you then maybe build a standalone point solution to fill that problem that everyone is mentioning about all of these other products? Like you can learn a lot from that and then create a solution that fits for the current category or creates a new category. So definitely like very useful data for you to have, but I don't think I would necessarily say you should limit yourselves to the categories as is. That wouldn't be the way I think to build a super disruptive business in the long term.
Sure. It almost reminds me of how you might look at SEO, and that you can get bad SEO advice, which is going to just focus on like writing content only for SEO's sake and not really thinking about like whether anyone actually wants to read that or you're actually helping someone or adding something of value. It's kind of a superficial way of looking at it. And there's almost this like superficial way of looking at categories and like getting overly hung up on this, the semantics and this specific name for a category. And then there's the more, I think, maybe practical and valuable way of looking at it. So for SEO, it would be like, yes, we want to rank for traffic, but let's also make sure we're writing something that adds value and is useful to someone. So when they get there, it's actually going to do more for us. And like with category, let's make sure that the way we've described our solution to a problem and how we frame that problem, let's make sure we're really thoughtful on that, because that's ultimately what's going to evoke emotion and action and get people excited about what you're offering. And the category name might be right, it might be off a little bit, but ultimately that's not the goal.
Yeah, I think you're 100% spot on. And I also don't think like people realize how hard category creation is, right? I'm sure people talk about this on the podcast a lot, but back when I was at HubSpot, right, launching HubSpot in Asia Pacific, inbound marketing wasn't a category in Asia Pacific until very, very recently, right? So like people in that market just wouldn't search for inbound marketing. They were searching for terms like digital marketing. So there's like regional, nuances to categories, even if like the features and the benefits and the problems that you're solving and fixing and whatnot are still the same. The way they search and the maturity around the category name even can be very different. So I think it's just like worth realizing for folks that like creating a category is a lot harder before it becomes easier and you own it, right? And I think it doesn't always end well, but the ones that do it really well absolutely do a great job. So I think it comes down to realistically, like, is what you're trying to solve that problem, like, is there a true kind of like opportunity for you to like create new space in that world right now that it currently exists? And if so, awesome, like go in hard. If not, like maybe that's not the best place for you to focus your time. Maybe it's best for you to actually focus on an existing category, but create a product that is better than all the other tools or easier to use than all the other tools or cheaper than all the other tools. Like there are so many different elements around how you can win in an existing category.
Yeah, that's right. And both CMOs at HubSpot, Mike and Kip, told me that when they first started talking about inbound, it was like yelling into a void where no one was listening for a few years, and they just had to have the patience and the perseverance to push through it.
Totally. And I think, they had the strength to be able to push that because like they did know that what they were creating and this concept of like pulling people inbound versus pushing out and interrupting was actually uniquely different and was a really different and unique way to package up these like products that solve product problems.
Sure.
Whereas if you're just kind of thinking up a pithy name for the sake of it, but it's the same thing, then I would say like, I don't know how successful you will end up being.
Yeah, that's a little
contrived. It's hard to build momentum, I think, around that.
Yeah, and that actually leads to an example that I just read about earlier this afternoon. Maybe you read the same story, but there's a category called conversation intelligence, and I actually did an interview with Gong, with Chris Orlob a few months ago when we talked about the conversation intelligence category, and Chorus is another one who's promoting this category.
Yeah.
And just recently, Gong announced that their category is now called revenue intelligence. And I haven't really had time to dive deep into this, but I'm wondering what your take is. Is this just like overly thinking about it like too hard, and is this more contrived, or can you think of like a more thoughtful or strategic reason why they might want to choose another term from what they've been using for the last year or two?
Yeah, I mean, I can only kind of like make my thoughts just on like what I'm hearing. And again, I haven't seen the way they're communicating about those categories. So like this is going to be a very uneducated response. But, I think like a few initial thoughts, right? Like there's definitely more categories now around conversations. And so conversation intelligence, right? When you immediately said that to me, the first thing that kind of came to mind was, like a reporting components of conversational marketing. And when I think of conversational marketing today, and the way people search for conversational marketing and the intent that they're showing is more around kind of how do I create conversational experiences on the web? So it's typically like through chatbots in terms of what we're seeing right now, right? And I think Drift have done a very good job at trying to like own that space. So I think, just for you saying that then an immediate kind of recall, like I wouldn't have thought of conversational intelligence meaning kind of like analyzing the conversations, but that very naturally makes sense. So I don't know. So it could be like a good move. It could be a bad move. I mean, was it revenue intelligence you said?
Yeah, revenue intelligence.
I mean, again, it's hard to say because, we don't know you or I the direction of their product, right? Like if their product now is going deeper into revenue and less into kind of like, if I think about kind of, let me actually take a step back. If I kind of just compare on the surface level revenue intelligence versus conversation intelligence, what I like about revenue intelligence is that it's like output focused, right? Like a conversation is the input, revenue is the output. So it's kind of like a bit of a catch-22 in that like you're getting the intelligence from the conversations, but you actually don't really give two kind of rats about the actual conversational intelligence. It's really about like what that then means for revenue. So I do like that in terms of it being outcome focused. And I think that is definitely going to pique someone's ears more so because it's focused on like a more meaningful thing, revenue, whereas conversations aren't really classified as that meaningful in my mind. Like they're a means to an end.
Sure.
So I like that. Yeah, I think that's like a unique way to think about it. On the flip side though, right? Like revenue intelligence, there's a lot of things that can lead to revenue intelligence and you don't necessarily immediately think it's going to come from conversations. So now it might be a more meaningful category to think of it in their mind and to their buyer. But now you might be competing with a very different range of other revenue intelligence products that have nothing to do with kind of call recordings.
Yeah, that's right.
For better or worse, I don't know,
And conversations can take place in contexts that are not revenue dependent either. So
that's true. Yeah. And I think conversations can happen, like a conversation can be kind of in text, right? Whereas my understanding of Gong and Chorus right now, it's like audio analysis. So, a lot of conversations are happening over email, right? Maybe more actually are happening over email than over audio and video. So
sure.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And I don't know if Gong intended that, if they intended revenue intelligence as a replacement for conversation intelligence or as a new additional category on top of that. So something I need to dive a little deeper into.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Who do you think's doing a great job with positioning and messaging today?
Good question.
Besides G2.
I think we've got a lot of areas we can improve.
Well, your team, to be fair, you guys did win some awards. Your product marketing team won some awards recently.
Right? I know. I was pretty amazed by that. We have a small but mighty team of product marketers, Yoni, Orban, and Gina. And, for them to win kind of like that. I don't know if I think it was definitely an America-wide award from the Product Marketing Alliance, but it could have been even global. I'm not sure. I don't want to like oversell it. But anyway, very big award. Very proud of them being ranked like the number one product marketing team. So they're doing really cool things. But yeah, I think outside of G2, if I think on the consumer side, like I've just always been, I always swoon pretty hard over, what Airbnb is doing. Like I just love the way they've kind of like thought about like kind of what is the value that their users, their buyers get out of their service, right? And that whole live like a local campaign just like beautifully encompasses that. Like I love Airbnb and I use it because like I want to feel like a local. I don't want to be in a hotel. Like to me, hotels are sterile and they remind me that I'm not in a place that I want to like live in. And when I go on a vacation, I want to feel like I'm immersed. So I love what they do. On like the B2B side, I'm a big fan of what Asana does. Like a lot of their messaging is very much like output focused in terms of, so Asana is a productivity tool, one of many great productivity tools. It's the productivity tool that we have chosen at G2 to use, that me and my team have used. I use it at HubSpot. And they do a really beautiful job, as I mentioned, kind of talking about like how they help you do work better, get work done. It's not about kind of like the software. It's about like getting done, your work more faster, more efficiently, and with like joy. And they've built that into the product, right? Like there are certain things like when you tick a to-do list item complete, a unicorn will shoot across
Right.
your screen, right? Like, which is, they've really done such a beautiful job at like connecting in with those delight moments, right? Like, cause it does feel fun to get work done, right? Like to get like those to-do list items done, that's like one of the fucking highlights of my day. And so, when you see that little unicorn, you start to connect emotion more with them and their product and their brand. So they do it really well. I think, we mentioned Drift before. Drift has done a great job not only of category creation around conversational marketing, but I think they've done a great job with kind of telling a bigger story, right? Because, I think they started from pretty humble beginnings, and I'm a big fan of the team at Drift, know lots of them personally. But essentially like chatbots for your website isn't typically the thing that you would think of as being a super kind of like sexy thing.
Sure.
But I think they've done a really good job at kind of like helping people realize that like that is like, your homepage or your website is effectively, your retail store today in our world. And so, just like you wouldn't have kind of like a closed sign, you'd have someone there greeting people, like their product can do that for you. And so I think they've done a really good job at kind of like elevating the importance maybe of that category.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that's through, category creation, but part of it's also just through like really good marketing tied back to the values that, their buyers care about, which is like revenue and efficiency and sales.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned those two examples because Asana is competing in a pretty crowded space. Like, I don't know how many dozens of productivity tools out there,
There's
but
a lot, yeah.
Yeah, and certainly they haven't gone down the path of trying to create a new category, but they've differentiated through their branding and this idea. You mentioned the word joy, which is not sure a word I think you could ascribe to many other productivity tools. So it's interesting that jumped out to you, and that makes a lot of sense when you talked about the unicorns and like the other elements and the user experience that make it really fun to use. But then with Drift, they are going down the path of category creation, but I also see them doing a great job with their branding as well. And that, like, they talk about this idea of conversational marketing. I was about to say intelligence,
Yeah.
and it's like this idea of like these, now like live conversations, no delays. And when you look at like the colors they've used, like they've got these vibrant colors. It's almost like this graffiti type visual aesthetic.
Done a very good job with that.
Yeah, and it kind of conveys this idea of like things that are like happening right now. There's like this energy behind it, which is great to see them not just doing category design well, but also using branding to support like a visual version of like the core problems they're trying to talk about.
Totally. And it's funny that you say that, like, in crowded spaces, like, I think that's definitely sometimes a challenge, right? Because, and I think brands often oscillate between using descriptive language. So like, let's use kind of, Asana as the example, right? Like descriptive language in my mind is like project management software. Yeah. Versus kind of like emotive values, output driven language, which would be like, right now their tagline is, it's like make more time for the work that matters most.
Okay.
Which is a little bit wordy on what they used to be. It used to be a little bit more succinct. Teamworks right now is like working together, full stop, beautifully. Right. So like if you compare them to, like, that's very similar. Make more time for the work that matters most. It's like emotive, working, doing the right work and working together beautifully. So I think the challenge sometimes can be, right, when you start to go down those emotive paths, is that it's, yes, you all start to sound semi-similar. And also for like some buyers, they may come to your site and then just be a little bit confused around like, what is it that you actually do, right? Like, so I'm on Slack right now, their website, and there's this, their tagline on their homepage is whatever work you do, you can do it all. So you can do it in Slack, which is high level. I can understand that. It kind of pulls me in and makes me then want to keep reading their subhead, which is Slack gives your team the power and alignment you need to do your best work. Mm-hmm. So like they've definitely gone down like the outputs and the values messaging, right? Like they're not saying the world's number one like internal chat system or like, chat app or a messaging app.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you they would have gone down that path early on, like when they were solidifying like who they were. And I think once you start to get momentum and you start to see like the organic and the viral growth, then I think you've got word of mouth marketing driving your messaging around what your product does. Then you can start to play a little bit more in the emotive world. That's just like my immediate sort of like gut take on it.
Yeah. Yeah. With that message you just read me to Slack, it almost suggests that you maybe have an idea of what Slack does, like it's a communications platform. And now they're building on that to say, you can actually do all your work in Slack, or I can't remember the exact messaging, but
Yeah.
it kind of reminds me of the way BMW went back and forth with their messaging. So for years, they used the ultimate driving machine, which is like a very clear like positioning statement around. It's like an engineering based statement, right?
Hmm.
Not certainly not emotive. But then a few years ago, they shifted to this idea of joy. I guess kind of like Asana. I can't remember the catchphrase. It was like the power of joy or the joy of driving, something like that. And then they shifted back to the ultimate driving machine. I think after that,
Mm. I
which
think it's a
is
pretty common thing. And I think it's probably worth noting that the average tenure of a CMO, right, is like
mm,
a couple years. And, I think depending on like the study you see, like it might be, 18 months, it might be 24 months. But I think what I tend to see happen is companies, like if they don't find the right CMO, they don't know what they don't know. And so like they don't like what it was. The new CMO comes in, they change it to be too far right, and then they don't like that. That person leaves, and then they bring in another CMO, and then they go too far left. And I think kind of like marketing and tech, anyways, in B2B world is kind of like still in a bit of an optimization phase where, I think for like the last 5-10 years, we've been as an industry maybe over indexing into like data driven demand gen marketing focused on conversion and not enough on like kind of like brand and emotion. And now you're seeing a lot more brands, some of the ones that we've been talking about, and just a lot of the more popular brands today leaning much more into branding and into
mm,
messaging. And I guarantee, in a few years we'll have another course correction, right, where we'll go too far in that direction and not be driving enough of the metrics, and then we'll kind of maybe land in the middle or maybe go too far the other way, right? I think that's just like a bit of a natural ebb and flow.
it's almost like a pendulum. And we had all these
Mm.
tools that were introduced to us with marketing automation and digital marketing and all the other things that allowed us to do. And so we got very focused on the mechanics of marketing, and
Yeah.
have really shifted away from how brands connect with
And
people
I
on a more
think as
emotional level.
well, right? Like I think what's actually important to think about, and this is where I guess, I'm a little bit kind of like cautious with sometimes categories or these platforms that kind of say they can do everything, is that, to your kind of point just then, like there has been such an explosion in software and in technology, right? And, thankfully, like we've been able to ride that wave. And that's why, millions of people come to G2 every week to find software for their business. But I think what's happened though is a lot of software companies, to try and drive like double digit, like 100% year over year sort of growth, they've sold vaporware, right? They've
Mm,
like sold messages around what their products can do, and more often than not their product can't live up to that, right? And I think we're still not at the point where like every company is like totally like data first, data driven, and it's still not that easy to connect up all of your different tools and use them properly. And so, long story short, like I don't think today it matters how good like each point solution is, because a lot of the time you have technology debt between your current platforms that you use and then your new platforms. And if the data can't like sync up and connect with them all properly, then if we use kind of revenue intelligence that you mentioned earlier with Gong, if they can't kind of like pull in all of that data from your CRM properly to then connect kind of their own analytics with kind of the output sales to then start to learn about your exact sales cycles and things, their tool will never be able to be as smart as it could be, right? Because it's like limited by your data inputs from other sources. And so I just think like that's something that's like worth calling out, is that like we're still, I think, pretty early days. Like there's so many great solutions out there, but there still aren't a ton of examples where people have connected all of those things really perfectly just yet, where it works, doesn't break, and people are really getting like uplift for the amount of money that they're spending on software.
Yeah. No, that reminds me of a tool I used or tried to use a few years ago, where I was supposed to get a lot more insight on what events on our website led to certain outcomes. And we just couldn't get the data clean enough and normalized enough
Yeah.
to really find it anything
It's
useful.
really tough. I think sometimes I hear a lot about, people oftentimes at CMO events that I'm at or dinners that I'm hosting or might be a guest at, like I'll hear, the discussion oftentimes about attribution comes up, right? Like first touch, last touch, multi-touch, like weighted, all the different types. And I like oftentimes think like marketers like spend way too much time trying to like over optimize attribution, and realistically like they're never going to get it perfect, and there are other things that you could spend your time focusing on to drive like better results. And yeah, I think sometimes like you can kind of just lean a little bit too hard into certain areas. And yeah, so I think like any software that kind of says it's going to solve all of your issues, like I would be a little wary.
Yeah. At a certain point, you can't rely on data or split testing or multivariate testing, whatever you want to call it. You just have to, use your instinct, use your gut, use what you learned, and make some thoughtful decisions, and then just have the courage to run with it.
Totally, right? Like, let's use a really basic software category like email marketing as an example, right? If you're like starting up, building a company, you might have been told that you need to do A/B testing. The reality is like you're never going to be able to do A/B testing where it works for you, maybe ever. When I was at HubSpot and even the exact target, it wasn't unless we were sending emails to like millions of people oftentimes, whereby, and again, you can do some tests that like what you're testing is so dramatic that the results will be big enough, but oftentimes you're not doing dramatically different tests because like you've already gotten things like pretty optimized and you're testing smaller things, and they don't drive a big enough change to then give you statistical significance so that you can then say, okay, like this test categorically won. We know it wasn't just by chance. Like it was the change that we made. The reality is like if you're like starting to build an email list and you're a small medium business, like, you might never have more than 1,000 contacts on your email list, or even 10,000. And you most likely need a lot more than that to get like statistical significance. So I just think like sometimes it's worth, companies won't oftentimes share that sort of input, right? They'll upsell you to get more features so you can do A/B testing, but they won't then tell you that A/B testing isn't something that you will ever actually get value out of until maybe year 5.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great kind of reminder to conclude the interview with. If you're going down this path of category design, if you've got a new problem you're solving, that's great. But what you're saying is, look, you can't get so far ahead of yourself that you end up causing frustrations with, by setting the wrong expectations or selling, vaporware. You really have to be mindful about offering something that's truly valuable and truly unique and truly usable today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like what's usable or valuable to your buyer doesn't necessarily need to be disruptive, right? I think like we get often a little caught up in this idea that like category creation or kind of category success or even company success needs to be because you're disrupting, the big incumbents in this big old school space. Like there aren't many companies that do that and do that successfully, right? Like you can disrupt competitors by focusing on a lot of other things and more niches and pricing and features. And, that's like a more, I think, like incremental way to think about category creation or category success versus like category disruption necessarily. So just different ways to kind of skin the cat.
That's great. All right. Well, we're almost out of time, but any other advice or pointers you want to leave our listeners with?
No, I mean, I hope this was useful really to folks. And, I'm super active on social and online. And so if anyone has like listens to this and has a question, they can email me, ryan@g2.com, or, Ryan Bonnici is my like handle on all the social medias. So if anyone wants to, connect on social, very happy to chat offline.
Good deal.
I guess that's technically online, but anyhow, you get me.
Either way. All right. Well, it's great being with you today, Ryan. Thanks for all the advice you shared. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, John. You too. Appreciate your time.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay, that wraps up this episode of the Category Creation series. I hope you enjoyed it and that this episode made you, in at least some small way, a better marketer. If you have questions about this episode or want to talk further about messaging, positioning, or category creation, my name is John Ruggi, and you can reach me at john@flagandfrontier.com. That's JOHN@flagandfrontier.com. Or you could look for me on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big 3, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.